Hello everyone, welcome to my Ghostwire Tokyo, Tatari difficulty, no healing items, no skill upgrades walkthrough. This is chapter 4, and this is the final chapter of the game before we initiate the game's endgame stage, where once we've done this chapter, we will get to a point of no return where we cannot return to the open world, and we have just 2 chapters to do in the finale of the game. And this is really where the game's pacing doesn't make any sense, because the ending of this game, it really feels rushed. The build-up towards the penultimate showdown with Hanya is way too rushed. The boss fights against Okina and also Hanya in the last 2 chapters of the game after chapter 4, they don't feel as good. I mean, Okina's worse, and she's the worst boss ever made in Ghostwire Tokyo, and she's the worst boss ever made by Tango Gameworks so far. And then the final boss fight against Hanya is just a very simple encounter. I mean, I'm okay with it being simple, but it's a little too simple, if you know what I'm saying. Because if you know how to do the fight correctly, you can avoid a lot of douchey attacks that he has. And I guess that's another problem I have with Hanya. He has some of the same bullshit that Okina had, only it's just a little bit easier to avoid those kind of moves and just prevent him from doing them. And all of that together just leads me to question whether the final parts of this game's development were impacted by some kind of financial crisis, because it really felt like a lower budget was provided for the finale of the game. And the game just ends, and it's like, what happened to all the spirits? Like, why haven't the spirits been returned to Shibuya? Why haven't we spoken to KK's wife and son? Like, why haven't we had proper conclusion of these characters? The game just ends when you just leave the afterlife, when you leave that Daidarobochi, which is that giant. And that's what everything is. Well, what happened to the giant? If Akito was leaving the giant entirely, why didn't we see him leave and then we see what happened to the giant? It's so confusing. It doesn't make any sense. Clearly, this game wasn't rushed out the door like Resident Evil Village was, because Resident Evil Village is the most rushed Resident Evil game I've ever seen. I mean, aside from Resident Evil 0. But just the way the developers were trying to delude themselves into thinking that Resident Evil Village wasn't rushed, and then the limited time and budget that they put into certain areas, like with Beneviento and Moreau, it really spoke high volumes of how poor and how fucking stupid the development of Resident Evil Village was. And there was a point in my blind playthrough of Resident Evil Village where I thought this game was going to get worse, and I said so before Heisenberg's factory, because Moreau's area, the boss fight against Aureus, the Stronghold Lycan encounter, they destroyed a lot of my morale to even offer some semblance of positivity for the later areas of Resident Evil Village. And luckily for me, Heisenberg's area was a lot of fun in my blind playthrough. But the fact that they even voiced those thoughts, why would they do that to someone like me, a true Resident Evil player, someone who was heavily excited about the game? And to relate this to the point I'm trying to address with Ghostwire Tokyo, Resident Evil Village had a lot of bad areas, and I was really expecting the game to get worse. And it really didn't get worse. But with Ghostwire Tokyo, this game has been so much of a blast to play in my blind playthrough that when I got to the part where we actually create the motorcycle and then the game reveals that text box saying, oh, you're at the penultimate showdown, you cannot return to the open world, it just came out of the blue, and I'm just like, is this really the end? Because everything that I've been doing so far hasn't felt like it's been setting up an ending. It really has. Not even the fact that I'm constructing this motorcycle feels like it's contributing to the ending. And we've heard brief snippets about this motorcycle being able to drive through the fog, and, you know, I didn't expect the game to just immediately transition into the end game phase. I just thought some other set piece would happen where an enemy would come, or like Hanya would show himself, and it would delay our attempt to get to the fog, even though we constructed the motorcycle. But no, it all goes according to plan, and we just get to the end of the game. It just feels so rushed, and there is no possible way this game had a limited time and budget. It doesn't make any sense. But then again, when you look at how simple some of the animations look, when you look at some of the encounters with the enemies, and when you look at the way the hit reaction is on the strike attack, the lack of potential with the perfect block, maybe this game did have a low budget, because, you know, Evil Within 2 didn't sell as well as the Evil Within 1. That's what I heard when I was looking at Tango Gameworks' financial report on the Evil Within 2. Apparently the game didn't really sell that well. So I guess maybe that contributed in part to Ghostwire Tokyo's rush development at the last part of the game. But it really felt like a lot of the ideas were there to really make this game fun, but then they just rushed it out the door, and it seriously just doesn't sit right with me at all. And that is my main gripe with the game. I mean, that's the biggest gripe I have about the game, is just how rushed the ending is. And, I mean, there are some minor gripes I do have about the game that I've already voiced in my blind playthrough, and I've already voiced in my walkthrough so far, but none of them compare to my thoughts on the ending of the game. And that's all I really have to say about that. But right now, for Chapter 4, we're cleansing more Torii gates, which again, it really feels like they used the Torii gate mechanic as just a substitute for actual linear set pieces, which kind of sucks, but I mean, there is something engaging about them, don't get me wrong. But it would feel a lot more tolerable had the game not been so short, and if there were a lot more linear set pieces, like in The Evil Within. But this is just a general problem I have with a lot of open world games. Open world games don't embrace enough linear set pieces. Linear set pieces have a lot more emotional impact, a lot more time and dedication put into them when it comes to unique set pieces, like unique animations, like unique combat encounters. And that's exactly what we got in The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2. But sadly, the blemishes of open world design had an impact on this game negatively. When you're just going through the game again and you're realizing just how much they use the Torii gate mechanic in place of actual linear set pieces to progress the story, which again could be in part due to the limited time and budget. But this game had really great marketing. This game had a really passionate developer with Akumi Nakamura just advertising the game, and the initial gameplay of Ghostwire Tokyo was pretty cool. But of course, I shouldn't have fallen for this marketing strategy, because as I should have learned with Resident Evil Village, marketing doesn't speak high volumes as to what the game is like. The marketing for Resident Evil Village was honestly one of the strongest forms of marketing I'd ever seen for a Resident Evil game, and the trailers for Resident Evil Village are my favorite trailers in the entire Resident Evil series. I mean, the only form of marketing I don't like for Resident Evil Village is that doll show that they made, just completely advertising the game in a lighter tone, in a very childish tone, and it just completely takes away from the seriousness of Resident Evil Village. Why would you waste time and money on that kind of stupid puppet show? I'm so glad I didn't watch it, because it feels about as cringy as some of the marketing for Resident Evil 2 Remake, and I really feel like the marketing for Resident Evil 2 Remake was very weak, because it tried to appeal to all the hopeless fans who thought Resident Evil would never come back, like their version of Resident Evil that they thought wouldn't come back. And you had like cringy trailers like with Leon saying it's coming back, or that live action trailer that they released where they had some random people just play the roles of Leon and Claire, and they were just trying to be all campy and funny, this and that, while there was a zombie outbreak happening, and it just looked so cringy. It looked about as bad as some of Ubisoft's marketing for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And why the fuck would a developer invest time and money into that when they could be investing all that time and money into the actual game's development, into creating more interesting set pieces? And in Resident Evil 2 Remake's case, the marketing was just as bad as the game itself, and Resident Evil 2 Remake is one of the most underwhelming, most boring Resident Evil games I have ever played, and it just spat at the quality that was present in Resident Evil 7. The amount of creativity and the amount of quality present with Resident Evil 7 that really made it stand out as the last true Resident Evil game, all of that was completely ignored by new Capcom. They just wanted to make Resident Evil 2 Remake very simple, not capitalizing on the hidden designs put in place with Resident Evil 7, the amount of complexity put in place with Resident Evil 7, the interesting DLC content, and instead for DLC content for Resident Evil 2 Remake, we got a reskin of Fort Survivor mode, and it was pretty much the case with the Ghost Survivors DLC, and then we had that No Way Out scenario, which was nowhere near as interesting as a Night Terror DLC, because it was just a bunch of zombies. And then you had a bunch of new enemy types that were just zombies reskinned to have very different fundamental parameters, like poison zombies or pale heads or all these other like slow zombies. And it's just boring. It's so lacking. It is just so cheap in its implementation. And if only this proportion would hold true for Resident Evil Village. Like, if poor marketing leads to a poor game, then great marketing should lead to a great game. And the marketing for Resident Evil Village was great, so I thought the game would be really good. But the game is not that good, and I gave Resident Evil Village a 4 out of 10, or maybe even like a 3.5 out of 10, because despite the positives of Resident Evil Village, overall, as a game, it is very, very poor. It is really poor, but I still like it more than Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake. But again, relating this to Ghostwire Tokyo, the marketing for this game was decent. And, I didn't really expect much from Ghostwire Tokyo, but it was a fun game. And, it's not exceptional. It's nowhere near as exceptional as The Evil Within. But it was fun. But the ending of the game is one of the worser parts of Ghostwire Tokyo. And it sucks. It really does suck. Oh, and by the way, right here, we have this set piece here where this giant will appear and spawn in enemies when we're trying to get to the story gate. And I really thought after the whole Torii Gate set piece where that barrier came, and also this set piece where the giant came, I thought the Torii Gates were going to have a lot more unique animations, but they don't, and it sucks. Because you don't have to cleanse all of the Torii Gates. There are only a certain amount of Torii Gates that you do need to cleanse. But I would have really hoped for more unique moments like that with the Torii Gates to really defy the player's expectations. But it didn't really happen. And instead, all we're doing for the rest of Chapter 4 is cleansing more Torii Gates and following KK's lead, where he will lead us into a garage where the motorcycle is. Then we have to collect underworld oil. Then we have to collect a turbine wheel. And once we've done all that, we've gotten to the finale of the game, and it doesn't feel substantial as a build-up towards your endgame phase. It makes no sense. It really doesn't make any sense. I'm going to reiterate on this point. It doesn't make any sense. But I don't want to flog this dead horse any longer than I need to. Once I get to those parts, I'll actually talk about what's happening. But until that point, I'm just going to go on different tangents. And I'm going to talk about Carcinogen SDA. So it turns out Carcinogen SDA has Ghostwire Tokyo, and he is planning on doing a no-damage walkthrough of Ghostwire Tokyo, which was cool to see. And he commented on the previous video that I set up for my Ghostwire Tokyo walkthrough. And he said that the rest of the game is pretty easy, and he doesn't like Yasuo Toko, which I found to be very surprising. I'm surprised he hated Yasuo Toko, yet he didn't really hate Okina a lot more, because Okina is a very broken fight, because the amount of input drops present, where the jump just doesn't register, and the one move that she has where she slams the ground, and it's physically impossible to initiate 2 jumps in rapid succession, because the pulses move at a rate faster than your ability to initiate 2 jumps in rapid succession, and they're so close to each other, it's just so unfair. Not to mention that in order to avoid those kind of bullshit attacks, you have to stay close to Okina and limit her moveset, which is further justification for the fact that they designed a very shitty boss fight. I'm amazed that he didn't consider Okina to be worse. And I'm guessing he understands the simplicity involved with the final boss fight and the way in which you can actually force him to do very limited movesets and target one specific head at the beginning of the fight, to make the fight a lot easier and a lot less douchey. I'm guessing Carcinogen SDA understood that amount of simplicity to the final boss fight, but it's still a little confusing that he would consider Yasuo Toko to be like the worst. I'm not too sure what his gameplay is going to be like, but it's probably worth checking out. I'll definitely check out his channel once he actually posts his walkthrough of Ghostwire Tokyo to see what he does. But, he's doing no damage. I'm doing no healing items / no skill upgrades. I wonder if he's doing no skill upgrades as well with his no damage walkthrough. I mean, I said I wasn't doing no damage because I don't feel like the game is complementary to the whole idea of no damage. I feel like doing no damage is kind of tedious and jarring. And also, with the fact that I'm just exposing a lot of cores and actually extracting them, it's recovering my health. So I figure the game wants you to embrace the whole idea of the healing items and the whole idea of extracting cores to recover your health and actually escaping combat. And I figured I'd follow the game's direction in that regard. And also, there are some pretty stupid combat encounters, like I mentioned with Okina, which I'm not willing to pay any respects to by doing no damage against them, because doing no damage would actually imply that the fights are really well designed. But with Okina, it's not the case. And I need to make these input drop errors known, and I need to showcase just the sheer stupidity in how the fight progresses, and these poor designs are putting stress upon me that I make mistakes. It's almost on par with that of Catwoman's Revenge from Batman Arkham Knight, and I did nearly an hour video just showcasing the sheer stupidity and the poor designs present with Catwoman's Revenge during that one combat encounter where you're fighting the Riddler robots, and you have lasers and electrified floors in the mix. The combat scenario isn't befitting for the combat system put in place with Batman Arkham Knight, and then you have a very meek character like Catwoman, and the gameplay has to represent this physical characteristic to Catwoman compared to Batman. so she does very little damage to the Riddler bots. And during that time, the electrified floor is progressing even more, and I'm just taking damage all the time. And it's clearly showcasing a lack of care displayed by Rocksteady. And it's like they wanted us to view Batman Arkham Knight as a joke. Like, they themselves view Batman Arkham Knight as a joke, that it bled into the actual gameplay design of Catwoman's Revenge. And there are people on Batman Arkham Videos' channel who have commented on that DLC, and they call it the best DLC of Batman Arkham Knight by far, or they call it better than Batman Arkham Origins. Yet, how can you be that fucking dense? Are you even human when you make that kind of statement? Only an alien would make that kind of statement, calling a completely broken experience functional and serviceable to the public. It's almost like, in a sense, they promote shoddy workmanship, and they also promote the whole idea of broken games being serviceable to the public as a challenging experience, when the whole idea of challenge is meant to fall into the realm of good design, functional design, and actual professional workmanship, not into the realm of stupidity. Like, that is the kind of encounter that Okina's boss fight reminded me of when I was doing it in my blind playthrough. And I'm sure after listening to all that, you can understand my justification for not wanting to waste time doing Okina no damage, because she doesn't deserve that amount of respect on my part. She doesn't. It's just a great example of the developers, a developer that I really cherished, just suddenly, for whatever reason, acting like they're high on drugs, and therefore this affects their decision making. And this is why QA was incapable of actually finding any of the input drop errors with Okina, and this is why Okina's boss fight is as such in this game. And it boggles the mind how Tango Gameworks, a developer who, this is their third game that they're actually making, and Evil Within did not have any bad bosses whatsoever, yet Okina was a big exception in this case. How does that make any sense? It just doesn't make any sense, guys. It really doesn't. But that's all I have to say about that. And just to conclude the original tangent I was discussing, I can't wait to see what Crescension SDA has for strategies and what his commentary is going to be like, and just his thoughts on the game. And, you know, I mentioned before in my blind playthrough that on the final video for that blind playthrough, I said in the title this game was an 8.7 out of 10, but I think after going through this game again and just understanding how short the main story is and how much the open world can be a bit of a bore after the main story is done, although I can't really factor that into my judgment whatsoever, because this is a trait that all open world games share. But just to talk about the experience of Ghostwire Tokyo after I've done the main story and the side missions, it is pretty tedious and really time-consuming, and it feels so much like a chore, just having to waste time collecting all the spirits, because there is a trophy on this game where you have to collect all of the spirits and then do the final encounter with Tanya in order to get the trophy. And originally, it was really starting to feel like a chore, and it was really starting to feel like a wild goose chase, because trying to figure out where these spirits were, and I might have missed some spirits in interior environments, was going to be a problem. But I realized there are certain beads that you can get that allow you to spawn an orb that will go in the direction of a nearby spirit, and it'll disappear after about a second. But it gives you an idea as to where the spirit is, and that's really good design. But at the same time, why would you make that a prayer bead? Why on earth would you relegate such a fundamental mechanic that feels more like a quality of life mechanic to a bead that you get when you cleanse Torii gates? It's almost like the developers ran out of ideas as to what to put for a prayer bead in that spot where you do get these prayer beads. And rather than think of something creative, they just opted to hide a quality of life mechanic behind the paywall, or behind the prayer bead. But I'm guessing it's not that big of a deal, because you aren't going to be so focused on finding all the spirits while you're in the middle of the main story. And plus, when you do beat the main story, the checkpoint that it gives you after you beat the main story is before you get on the motorcycle. So in a sense, it just teleports you back into the middle of the story, so then you can actually focus on the spirits. And by then, you've already had all the prayer beads, but that still doesn't change the fact that some of the prayer beads on this game do feel like quality of life mechanics just turned into an upgrade system. It's the same with some of the upgrades as well. Like, I mentioned many times that the upgrade system on this game is very rudimentary in its implementation, and in some cases this is good, because it means this is not your traditional RPG game where you're going to be wasting time just leveling up your character to actually get these skills that should have been available at the start. And plus, this is the game's way of saying that you already have access to everything that is complex at the start, and the only reason you'd want to get those upgrades is just for changes to your fundamental parameters, and that's it. But at the same time, just looking at certain upgrades, like for instance, the ability to finish off enemies on the ground with a quick purge, stuff like that feels like a quality of life mechanic. Or, for instance, just doing more damage to enemies on the ground. Like, stuff like that, it really does feel like a quality of life mechanic, just put behind an artificial paywall system, because they ran out of ideas as to what to do. Just like with Batman Arkham Knight, you know, I mentioned before in my Batman Arkham Knight walkthrough that the upgrade system in Batman Arkham Knight is nowhere near as good as the upgrade system in Batman Arkham City, because in Batman Arkham City, every single upgrade that you purchase is a brand new ability that you've never seen before in the previous Arkham game, which was Arkham Asylum. But for some reason in Batman Arkham Knight, rather than making every single ability new, they force you to rebuy abilities that you had to purchase in Batman Arkham City, and it's such a ludonarrative dissonance because it's almost like Batman's forgotten a lot of the basic abilities he was able to learn in Batman Arkham City. It's so confusing. It's almost like he's forgotten his training. It doesn't sit right with me, and it's a great example of the developers just putting in those kind of abilities in the upgrade system for Batman Arkham Knight just to make the upgrade system look appealing to the eyes of people wanting to slot into the upgrade system, and to even give you incentive to indulge in the upgrade system. And when it has to be for such a feeble reason like that, making you rebuy abilities that were already fundamental in the previous Arkham games, that right there doesn't make any sense. And in some cases this game does that, but I'm not trying to be so harsh against the upgrades on this game, because it's great that it's not a pay-to-win design. You know, Resident Evil Village has a very shitty upgrade system, because the upgrade system present in Resident Evil Village is the kind of upgrade system that is there to enhance your fundamentals, but they force it upon you so much in Village of Shadows difficulty. And, well, it doesn't feel as forceful in the earlier difficulties, even though on hardcore difficulty I still recommend getting the upgrades because some of the bosses take a ridiculous amount of punishment. The experience that you get on the easier difficulties is completely negligible because it doesn't showcase the developer's true mindset. It doesn't showcase the gameplay style and gameplay flow that they actually favor. It doesn't showcase the mechanics that they truly value. So your experience on the easier difficulties should not be a factor to consider when actually judging the way the upgrade system is implemented in Resident Evil Village. Like in Resident Evil 4, the merchant system was not forced upon you at all. This was the same case in Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. But in Resident Evil Village, because they haven't used the merchant system in a very long time and they just highly advertise it compared to the previous Resident Evil games, this psychologically just caused the developers to create a gameplay flow and gameplay system that is entirely dependent upon the merchant system in order to dictate the proper flow of fundamental gameplay. And that kind of pay-to-win design is no different to a microtransaction system, and that's why I despise it so much in that game. Because they hide a bunch of quality-of-life improvements behind a paywall system just to give some reason for the merchant to exist, and to give some reason to pick up loot from the enemies, or to even like search the environment for treasure and the like. And for a game that is all about Ethan's personal journey, do you really think it's satisfactory to build a gameplay experience where Ethan is constantly forcing himself to buy stuff from the merchant? So where is the whole phrase Ethan's personal journey when it's the merchant who is dictating the proper flow of gameplay? So it's like it's the merchant's personal journey in realizing the satisfaction he had in giving a customer the ability to fight off the infected. That's the message you're sending with that kind of upgrade system, and it's completely contradictory to the very message that they're trying to send with Resident Evil Village. And that is a great example of an upgrade system done very, very poorly in a Resident Evil game. And for a game that is meant to be inspired by Resident Evil 4, for them to force the merchant upon you so much is a massive disservice to Resident Evil 4, to some kind of inspiration generated from Resident Evil 4. And thank God Evil Within, Evil Within 2, Ghostwire Tokyo, their upgrade systems don't force anything upon you. And plus, you can't even factor like the prayer beads as part of an upgrade system because you get them as part of the main story. And they actually promote a bit of strategy in the mix because knowing which prayer bead is suitable for the combat situation that you're in is incredibly beneficial to creative play in Ghostwire Tokyo. Like, there are situations where I swap between gust beads, flame beads, and talisman beads in order to pick the bead that is suitable for the occasion. And this game really incentivizes you to experiment, which is definitely something that I'm glad they inherited from the Evil Within series, because the Evil Within series was all about that, knowing which weapon was good for the occasion, knowing how to save up on your ammunition, knowing how to actually get more ammunition, knowing the hidden mechanics of the enemies. Like, they favored so much creativity with those games, and they didn't try to put all that aside for a merchant system. Like, Resident Evil Village sacrifices so much creativity in order to make the merchant system feel very important. Like, in the process of trying to make the merchant system such an integral part to the fundamental flow of gameplay, they completely sacrificed any form of creativity in Resident Evil Village, and this was indicated by the highest difficulty in Resident Evil Village, because the highest difficulty in Resident Evil Village removed flinch animations. They made the bosses take even more of a punishment, the enemies take even more of a beating, and it's all done this way to force you to slot into the merchant system. They didn't bother putting in any kind of creative mechanic of being able to knock over enemies. They didn't want to be experimental, like with the Evil Within, for instance. They wanted to settle with the bare minimum for Resident Evil Village because of the limited time and budget that they had. But that still doesn't explain why they would remove flinch animations on the highest difficulty. What does limited time and budget have anything to do with the simple thought being placed in the developers to remove fundamental flinch animations from the game, or favoring very shitty enemy placements like with the two Moriekas in Bella's boss fight? Limited time and budget has nothing to do with thoughts that could put into the human mind. And the thoughts that went into Resident Evil Village, some of them feel like aliens designed certain parts of Resident Evil Village. But I'm kind of digressing on to Resident Evil Village right now, so I need to stop that, because I've been talking so much about Resident Evil Village. I need to talk more about Ghostwire Tokyo. But just to get back on the main tangent, the upgrade system, I don't have much of a problem with, but at the same time, there are those problems that are very strange, like when they lock certain quality of life mechanics behind an upgrade system in this game. But it's not to a severe degree like Resident Evil Village. So that's what I have to say right there. And it's nice that the prayer bead system offers a bit of creativity in the mix, and the developers really encourage you to experiment with the prayer beads because you get them as part of the main story when you're cleansing the Torii gates, because they didn't want you to miss out on this mechanic, which is good design. And the prayer beads can be really good because certain bosses like Okina, you need to have a lot of aqua beads. Like, you need to have a high enough aqua bead level in order to deal a lot of damage, just to speed up the whole process of looping her, because she's a broken fight. And then you have like the talisman beads. The talisman beads are very useful for dealing with multiple enemies because they increase the duration of your stun talisman, giving you more opportunities to quick purge the enemies. And yeah, it's a pretty fun system, and I do enjoy it. But that's all I have to say about that particular tangent. But right now, we're trying to get the turbine wheel and some fragrant underworld oil. I did a whole set piece where Akito is separated from KK, and you have to use the bow and arrow, and it's a pretty fun sequence. And it's a nice change of pace. But again, this kind of change of pace and this kind of change in the gameplay format, this feels like something that should have occurred at the middle of the game, not near the end of the game. Like, that feels like a kind of set piece you'd get in the Evil Within, for instance. Like, for instance, when you're trying to defend Joseph in that one set piece mission, like you're defending an AI partner as part of a unique change to the gameplay style, and is done rather poorly in the Evil Within. Only for the first phase, though, when you're protecting Joseph in Chapter 5. And he's not so much of an issue in Chapter 6, I would say, because his axe is really good and the enemies don't seem to prioritize him that much. But it's nice that they changed up the gameplay for the middle of the Evil Within, but they decided to do this with Ghostwire Tokyo, but near the end of the game, and that doesn't make any sense. But we're now inside of the underworld right now, and you can go to another underworld area like this when you cleanse all the Torii gates, and there's not much to offer in that area. I mean, there's a bunch of lamentations in the area, and you do get like Kuchisakes when you're trying to leave the area, but that's really it. But these underworld sequences, there's only 2 of them, and they work exactly the same. So you have a bit of a stealth sequence to do. There's a chance to be experimental with the enemies. But right now, with my limited combat capabilities, I'm trying my best to avoid combat with the enemies. There are a couple of Rainwalkers here, and then there are also some Lamentations and some Wanderers. There's some corruption everywhere, so just try to cleanse it by shooting the core that is exposed right over there. And yeah, I completely forgot to mention the prayer beads that I was discussing earlier. So there are two prayer beads on this game, Spirit Perception and Sleuth beads. So Spirit Perception allows you to generate an orb when you go into spectral vision that will move in the direction of a nearby spirit for a second. And then the Sleuth beads do the same, where it allows you to track down KK's investigation notes. And it's nice that the game provides this, because having to just wander around like a headless chicken, just trying to find these spirits and also KK's investigation notes, it's nice that they're streamlining the process by giving you these beads. But again, it feels like something that should have been integrated with the general spectral vision mechanic and not behind the prayer bead system. That's what I was going to mention before, but that's just a minor thing. That's all I have to say about that. But I've just killed that Lamentation. There's another Lamentation in the area. And once we get rid of these enemies, we're going to be dealing with a new enemy type. You do encounter this enemy type in the open world, but I only encountered it once in the open world. This is the Shiromoku. The Shiromoku is a giant. It's basically a frost giant, and it uses a bunch of ice-based attacks against you. It freezes the ground, so it slows your movement. It fires a really fast ice spear at you that is very hard to deflect, and it also has the ability to do a melee attack, which is easy to parry. And it also has the ability to do like a Crystal Soul Mask from Dark Souls, where a bunch of projectiles spawn from it and it hovers around it, and they slowly follow you, and you can perfectly block them or just lure them into obstacles, so it's not that bad. But the Shiromoku, the Ice Spear attack that is very fast, that's the most dangerous attack it has, because I just cannot get the timing down. And the Shiromoku have a lot of life, but the best way to fight that enemy is to use your fire, obviously, but use the charge attack on the fire, because when you do use the charge attack on the fire, it stuns it, but you have to wait until he recovers from the stun animation and he goes back into a neutral state, so that the stun will work. But that is the Shiromoku. You do also encounter this enemy in the Hyakiyako sections, if you do stumble upon them. But I'm going to try to make sure that I'm charging my flame so that I can actually stun this guy. But he moves around in a very erratic sort of way, even though his movement is slowed. The times when he just moves in a certain direction just out of nowhere can mess you up. But as you see right here, the charge attack on the flame is consistently stunning him. So try to be very strategic when you decide to use these propane tanks in order to expose more flame ether. And just stay on the move. Like, this is the move right here. That right there, you see how fast that Ice Spear is? It's so hard to react. You have to be so far away from him to even have time to react to that move. And perfectly blocking that attack, I'm not too sure when his animation indicates the perfect time to initiate a perfect block, because I still need to understand that move a little bit more. But I've run out of flame, and I'm very lucky that he is not doing any of his bullshit attacks, because I'm trying to experiment a bit right here. I think if you stay relatively close to him, he's more likely to do his melee attack, which is very easy to avoid, and also to perfectly block. But he's trying to close in on me right now. There's his melee attack, very simple. I'm just going to use the charge attack on water, and once again, this is the only utility for water on this game. The standard basic attack for water does very little damage. The charge attack does a lot more damage, and it's better at eliciting stuns on the enemies. But he's down, and my health regenerates up to that threshold, which is really good design. We get the Underworld Oil, and we need to escape now. So in both sequences in the Underworld, when you're trying to escape, corruption will come, and a bunch of high-tiered enemies will spawn when you get near the Torii Gate. I'm just going to make a mad dash past these enemies. The Lamentation does hit me, and the Kuchisakes come very close to hitting me, but I'm able to get out of there very quickly. And the last thing that we need to do is gain access to a turbine wheel. This is very easy to get. There's no real threats aside from one Relentless Walker. There are some spirits on the rooftop in case you want to get them, and watch out for the Wanderers as well. I do get into a spot of bother here with the Wanderers because the social status icon doesn't do the best job at indicating where these Wanderers are, because it doesn't indicate elevation. It doesn't indicate whether a Wanderer is above you or not. So I get into a bit of a bother here because, see, I took a projectile from above and I'm trying to find this guy, and then I realize I'm low on life and I'm not going to use healing items for this walkthrough. So I'm just going to move to a different spot, and there he is. And once again, quick purging these enemies does restore your life, which is really good design. I'm guessing this game really wanted you to be very aggressive against the enemies, and plus this complements the Wire-In ability, which I haven't talked about. So you can see on the bottom right, there is that circle that's golden, and that is my Wire In ability. So Wire In is basically your Rage of the Spartans move from God of War or something, only it's a little bit more reserved in this game, but you initiate a shockwave that exposes the cores of enemies and deals a bit of damage to other high-tiered enemies. And exposing the cores is a little bit easier when you're inside of that mode, and it does make a difference. And also, when you are extracting cores, your animation is faster. So it can be a good emergency move just in case you have a lot of enemies, and it's especially useful in the Hyakiyako sections when you have tons of students of misery or students of pain or a bunch of rainwalkers supporting each other. It isn't so useful against the bosses, based on what I've analyzed with Yasuo Toko. I don't see a lot of incentive to initiate the Wire In ability against the bosses. I don't think the Shockwave does any damage, and the enhanced damage provided by Wire In doesn't seem to contribute that much to reducing a boss's HP. So don't use Wire In when dealing with the bosses. I don't see the use for it. When you're using it against the normal enemies, it's perfectly fine. But this is the last thing that we're doing right here. We're just getting this turbine wheel, and the only threat that stands in our way is a relentless walker. And you would think as well, with this kind of limited threat, there'd be hallucinations or shifting of dimensions or changes in gravity, like something to really build up the ending. But it's all just dialogue between Akito and KK that doesn't feel like it's endgame dialogue. And it really puzzles me to this day. But this is practically the end of Chapter 4. Does this really seem like a build-up to an ending? It feels like something that would have occurred in the middle of the game. It really doesn't sit right with me. I hope you guys feel the same as well, because this really feels like a limited time and budget just personified in this ending. But stay tuned for the finale. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.